2009, in the wake of the financial crisis, the G20 and others called on the International Accounting Standards Board to change the requirements for how banks account for loan loss provisions. The international standard on accounting for financial instruments such as loans was called IAS 39. This standard was criticised for being too complex, and during the financial crisis, also for causing banks to recognise losses on bank loans and other financial assets too little, too late. This outcome was linked to restrictions in the standard on when loan losses could be recognised and what information banks could take into account when measuring the losses. IAS 39, like other accounting standards at that time, only permitted banks to provision for loan losses when they had hard evidence that losses were occurring. This model was called incurred loss accounting. Work on a new standard was accelerated in response to the financial crisis. That new standard is called IFRS 9. It replaces the incurred loss model in IAS 39 with a more forward-looking expected loss model. This means that banks and other financial institutions must start accounting for expected loan losses from the day they first lend money or invest in a financial instrument. This addresses the too late criticism of IAS 39. When measuring loan loss provisions, they will also be required to take into account all the reasonable and supportable information they have available, including forward-looking information. This means that if a bank expects credit conditions to decline, it must reflect that in its loan loss calculations immediately. This addresses the too little criticism of IAS 39.
The old standard was also criticised for not reflecting changes in economic risk on a timely basis. IFRS 9 addresses that by making changes in a bank's credit risk exposures more visible to investors and others. It requires banks to update their loan loss provisions to reflect changes in credit risk expectations every time they report. This means that if a loan goes from performing as expected to performing significantly worse than expected, investors will get information about that, something they have told us is important to them. With IFRS 9, the amount of banks' loan loss provisions will better reflect economic conditions and changes in those economic conditions. In some situations, the old system of IAS 39 created more volatility in the financial results than IFRS 9 will. This is because banks went from no provisions to recognising full losses when payments stopped, creating even more dramatic changes. Nevertheless, a more responsive loan loss provision could mean that there is more volatility in banks' financial results under IFRS 9. However, the accounting doesn't create volatility, it only reflects the economic changes. Some have suggested that reflecting the impact of economic volatility in financial statements must by definition be inconsistent with financial stability. We disagree. The International Accounting Standards Board's mission is to develop standards that bring transparency, accountability and efficiency to the financial markets around the world. This contributes to creating long-term financial stability in the global economy. IFRS 9 is important in this context. By reflecting economic changes and making increases and decreases in risks more visible, it will provide important information that will enable banks, investors and regulators to take necessary and timely action. I can't stress enough how important that is. We have seen several examples where failing to fix problems quickly led to bigger problems and often inhibit economic growth.
When a bank applies IFRS 9, its loan loss provisioning will likely end up being higher than they were under IAS 39. This in turn will mean that accounting equity will go down. However, that doesn't automatically have an impact on the levels of capital that banks will need to hold to meet bank regulatory requirements. IFRS standards and regulatory capital requirements have different objectives. IFRS 9 aims to provide investors and others with a neutral and timely view of the expected credit losses. Regulatory capital requirements, on the other hand, are designed to make sure that there is adequate capital for possible future losses. IFRS 9 determines how loan losses should be managed for financial reporting requirements. Bank regulators typically use these numbers as the starting point when they decide how much capital should have. However, they generally make adjustment to the accounting numbers. These adjustments are designed to ensure that banks have enough capital in good times to cope with the bad times. Regulators will decide what should happen to the bank's regulatory capital when banks first apply IFRS 9 and on an ongoing basis after that. While we have separate roles, the ISB works closely with bank regulators. We believe that while we fill complementary roles in the bigger financial regulatory system, we both contribute to financial stability, but in different ways.